I was a child of the Depression. My father came from a rather wealthy family, and who all lost their money in 1928. He said we were pioneers because they lost their money a year ahead of everybody else. Um, he was educated, and as I say, had been, but he was already in his 40s, and and the family spent the rest of the Depression years from, well, all through 1929, 30, and so on until the war, moving from place to place. We moved every year, a new school every year. That's a character building experience, and and one that's probably a good background for writers, because I often tell my writing classes that you need to have something happen to you before you can begin to write. You have to have some stories to tell, and I see too many kids, especially undergraduates, trying to do a whole movie or a novel or what have you, and nothing has ever happened to them. They don't have anything to say, except to recreate a whole lot of stuff that they've seen on television or in movie theaters. It's not very interesting. I think that probably the best qualifications for background for a writer are a short jail sentence and a couple of failed marriages. Then you got something to talk about, you know. Any case, so we moved a lot, and Pop couldn't find a job. Mother came from a New England family, and who had lost their money in about 1900, and so she had gone to Simmons College, a college for women, before World War I, and learned to type, which she told my sisters that they should never do, because she said, once they learn you can type, they won't let you do anything else. So, Mother, during this whole period of time in the Depression years, was always, as I was growing up, because I was born in 1925, so it was about 1930 that I began to have real memories and begin to have a sense of what was going on around me. And that was always of Pop looking for jobs, trying to do this, that, or the other thing. And a Mother always writing. She was a brilliant letter writer. And she was always writing pieces and sending them off to the New Yorker. And usually she would find a job either as a clerk for the one branch or other of the relief organizations that existed during the 1930s, and also for the local paper. You know, they would pay her $5 for an article or something like that. So I was always aware. There was always the sound of typewriting in the house when I was a kid, and always Mother sitting there, chain smoking, and one thing and another. She went through a period talking about, as I know I'm supposed to talk about a little bit later on, and so on, how writers write and so on. There's a period of time when she was convinced that the only way she could write was she would go into a darkened room, completely dark, close the door, take off all her clothes, and sit there with her a pencil and a pad of paper and wait until her hand would start to write. And she would be there for hours before it would start to write. And then when she came out of the room, put her clothes back on and read what she had written in the dark. At any rate, so there's a lot of mystery and magic to writing as well. So that was part of the background of the household. And it was kind of a tough life. I mean, it was interesting what was happening around. And my family was a contentious and emotional and I guess a difficult family too. I was a Westinghouse junior scientist. I was going to become a biochemist, and so I was learning all that, and I studied German because German was the language of science. Up until my first year, well, my education was so peculiar because I went to a whole series of public schools that were a total failure, and I got so bored one day. I can still remember it. 1934 it was, I guess. I was sitting in class, and I was really truly bored with things, and I just wondered what it would be like, whether I could write something that you could read in a mirror. So I borrowed, it was just before Thanksgiving, and I borrowed the mirror that we were using in class, as the pond that the Pilgrims were skating on before they had their Thanksgiving dinner with the Indians they'd invited, and all that little diorama. And I stole the mirror that represented the pond, and I started writing, mirror writing, and so on. And from that time on, for the next several years, that's all I could do. So I was going from school to school, and every school they would try to teach me a different new way of writing and one thing and another, but no matter what I did, whether it was cursive writing or block letters and so on, the teacher still had to get a mirror to read it. Took a while to get over that. In any case, I mean, nobody knew about dyslexia at that time, but it was a form of dyslexia, I guess. And I still have trouble sometimes of seeing B's as D's. At a certain point, one of Mother's old friends had married into great wealth and one thing and another, and through them they got me a scholarship to the Hill School, a boys' boarding school modeled on the English. We had everything except we had cold showers. The only thing we didn't have was caning, and beatings, but except informally administered one-on-one. But in any case, so I went to this prep school for 3 years, hating every minute of it. Got an extraordinary education out of it, and that got me into Harvard. And I was in my freshman year. At the end of the freshman year, I got thrown out of Harvard for not having gone to any classes and not taking any examinations and having had a fist fight with a cop and a few other things. And on my 18th birthday, I enlisted in the Army, volunteered for the paratroops, but my eyes were too bad, so I got sent to the infantry, and I spent 3 years overseas in the Pacific, in the Philippines and New Guinea. And during that time, what had happened, as I told you, my mother was a marvelous letter writer, and she had written a letter to, but she disliked something that Arthur Crock, the famous columnist for the New York Times, she disliked something that he had written. Mother was a very peculiar liberal in that she was virulently anti-Semitic and anti-black, but at the same time believed passionately in Roosevelt and the New Deal and everything so it was a little strange growing up in that kind of atmosphere of maintaining any kind of moral compass about exactly what was good and what was bad. But that was interesting in itself because it made you think. It made you think about life. Nothing was simple. Nothing was simple in our house. And I think that that's good preparation for writers too. In any case, she disliked something that Arthur Crock had written, and she wrote him a letter, and he got so pissed off by the letter. It was a very abusive letter that she wrote, and politely abusive in an intellectual sense, not respectful. So he was upset, and he wrote her a letter back trying to refute some of the points that she had made, but also adding as the concluding sentence was, "Suppose you tell me the secret of how you've retained your youth and charm." She got so pissed off at that she wrote him a 70-page letter, which is still in Arthur Crock's papers and so on. I've been trying to get it from his estate and so on because I'd love to read it. But in any case, she wrote him a 70-page letter, which he then passed on to the editors at Simon & Schuster with a suggestion that they ask her to write her autobiography because there was a great deal of autobiographical material in it. And the long and the short of it is Simon & Schuster gave her an advance to write her autobiography, and that was about 1940, just before we got into the war. It was published under the title Roughly Speaking and became a big success and was very well reviewed by the New Yorker and the New York Times and one thing or another. It was basically the story of how a girl of wealth and privilege who was cast into the trials and tribulations of the Depression with a handsome but reckless and rather feckless husband, which is not true. Pop was infinitely talented person and so on, but nonetheless she always made out that he was the cause of all the family problems, and she was the one that had to help overcome adversity and so on, and in the end comes out. It was a very rah-rah American flag waving thing, and it was just great for wartime. Any case, she wrote this and became successful, and it was bought by Warner Brothers to make into a movie. But by then, Pearl Harbor had happened, and all their staff writers were off writing training films or actually in the trenches fighting somewhere. So they asked her if she would come out and and try her hand at writing the screenplay. So she did, and it was made into a movie with Rosalind Russell playing my mother, and Jack Carson playing my father. It's called Roughly Speaking. It's a terrible movie. It still runs. A lot of people like it. In any case, it runs on Turner Classics every once in a while. So she moved out to the West Coast in order to do this, and Pop became her chauffeur and so on. So all that happened while I was away sleeping on the ground in the Philippines and getting shot at, trying to murder Japanese. So when I came back, I stopped off. I was going to go back and try to get myself back into Harvard. But I stopped off to see them, obviously. And she was under contract at Warner Brothers, so I went to Warner Brothers and visited a set. It was humoresque with John Garfield and, gosh, who was the woman? I can't remember. But in any case, I saw this wonderful, magical thing that is a movie set at the best. You know, it's pretend reality, but it also contains the seed of truth, and there's a little magic in it, and it's something that we make up. It's something that we create ourselves. And it was so absolutely mesmerizing and fascinating that I knew somewhere in my heart that that was something that I was going to have to do. And furthermore, I had lost my interest in science while I was in the war, and also during my freshman year. I went to a few lectures on chemistry given by James B. Conant, and I couldn't stay awake, so I realized I was going to have to do something different. And I'd met some people in cultural anthropologists while I was there, including Timothy Leary, and who was in the psychology department there. So when I came back to Harvard, I took up cultural anthropology because I found that a fascinating way of looking at human behavior, the way in which a culture, a township, a city, a job, a corporate structure, or what have you, affects the behavior of the people who are within it. What is the nature of when we say culture? What do we mean? We know intuitively what we mean by it, but how does it actually function? How is it that cultures bring up children that who become, who are part of that culture and will carry on and replicate that culture as they grow up and grow through the stages of their lives and all the rest of it? And that's essentially what a writer does in creating. You're creating a culture of that story. Those people who are embodied in that story are acting out something that is partly their own impulses and their own instincts, but it also is colored and affected so deeply and maybe even determined by the other people around them who are reacting in a certain kind of way that they were trained to do and to become. That's all, that's all writing stuff. So at any rate, I was away for 3 more years with that, got married, got out, went to work for Time magazine. I think this was a psychological problem that I had about competing with my mother. She had been a successful screenwriter. By this time, she had come to the end of her career, and she was writing a column for the Santa Monica Outlook, which is what she did for the rest of her life. Any case, and she was everybody loved her a lot, and she was sort of a local character in many ways. But I knew that somehow or other, eventually I'd get back to Hollywood and do this, but I postponed it as long as I could. When I got out of college, I discovered that there were no openings for cultural anthropologists, at least not with my background, and so I applied for a job at Time and Life, and I had been in a creative writing course at Harvard where I took such an intense dislike to this snotty son of a bitch teacher, a poet named John Chiardi, a real first-class bastard. He demeaned and insulted his students and spent most of the time just reading his poetry aloud. In any case, I got so disenchanted with the writing process in his class that I destroyed everything that I had written in the class, and I had nothing from any period before that in my life that was like creative writing. So they said at Time and Life magazine, well, we love you and we'd like to hire you, but what have you written? So I had to write something. So I sat up all night and I wrote a parody of a Time cover story, and I wrote some other little things, I don't know, and I gave them to their recruiter, who called me and he said, listen, I still like you, we want to have you, we think you're part of the or should be part of our organization, and we will hire you in our executive training program on one condition, and that is that you never, ever try to write. And I had no other choice. There were no other jobs that were being offered me, so I went to work for $40 a week sorting mail in the Time and Life mailroom. And within a year, I was writing for Life magazine. And I spent the next 7 years working for Time and Life, first in New York, and then moved to the Beverly Hills Bureau, where I covered aviation and military affairs and movies. So I got to spend a lot of time on movie sets and was, really sort of cultivated by people, which had nothing to, Walt Disney wanted to have lunch with me every month and all that kind of thing, which was not because I'm such a fascinating, or was such a fascinating character, but just working for Time and Life, where they wanted to get the media, we didn't call it media in those days, attention. I worked that to the hilt, and I spent an enormous amount of time on sets, getting to know movie people and learning as much as I could from sitting on the sidelines, and then very quietly beginning to write more than the stories that I was writing for Time and Life. I covered Marlene Dietrich's opening at the Sands. I got to see an atom bomb exploded in the Nevada desert. I went to air shows where I saw airplanes crash before my face and eyes. I was inside nuclear reactors. I was on aircraft carriers. I sat down with governors and heads of state and one thing and another as a reporter for Time and Life. And Time and Life in those days was an extraordinary organization. There was an enormous respect for the media that doesn't exist anymore. And also absolute access. Nobody had spin doctors and press relations people and one thing and another. You called the governor of Texas and he got on the phone because you were talking from Life magazine. And here I am, this kid, calling him. It was a great experience, and the accumulation of events and experiences and so on that I've been able, in some way or other, whether I have actually ever used those literally in my writing, they have informed what it is that I write. I learned so much about people and about how they behaved under certain circumstances, both in the Army, both in the experience of growing up in this tumultuous and crazy family, and also through working in the news media. In any case, I realized that sooner or later I was going to have to make the break and try to write for movies. In those days, there were no film schools. There was no way to learn any of this, and they did not buy original screenplays. But then along came television, particularly live television, where they did buy original stories, and where it was an open door. So I began to write pieces and send them to things like Playhouse 90 and Studio One and those things and so on. And eventually I quit my job. Or actually I arranged to get with some friends of mine at the magazine to have them fire me, because that way, if they fired me, I got my accumulated pension, what was accumulated in my pension plan, which was like $7,000. It was a lot of money in 1956 or 58, whenever it was. My wife and I lived on what we had, and for 2 years, well, I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and sent things out and sent things out, and nothing's sold. I did have an agent. He wasn't able to do anything for me. And I finally reached the point where I had to face the fact that I was never going to get a job in this business, and had grown a beard, and which was a strange thing to do in those days. And on a Friday, my wife had by then had gone to work, so that we'd have some money. And I shaved my beard off because I realized on the following Monday I was going to have to go and get a paying job doing whatever. And so I shaved my beard, and on Monday morning I got a call that my first script had been sold. And I also got a call back from Sam Rolfe at Have Gun Will Travel, which was one of the top 10 shows in those days. And he was looking for a script doctor, and he wanted somebody who, in his eyes, had not been trained and tainted by working for other shows. He wanted somebody who would come in and just, well, to start clean, as it were. So the first thing he did was hand me a couple of scripts that had that weren't quite ready to shoot, and one thing or another. And he said, "See what you can do with these." So I rewrote them, and he said, "That's great." So I had the job as story editor on Have Gun Will Travel. Partly because of Sam's personality, but partly also because that's the way things were in those days. They left us completely alone. We would get notes on the scripts, but the notes usually came in. We'd already shot the show by the time the notes came in, and we didn't pay any attention to them anyway. There was a CBS executive who was supposed to look over our shoulder and so on. I don't think we ever saw him. Never came on the set. I never talked to him, and I don't think Sam talked to him very much. There was Sam, there was myself as the story editor, and Sam's secretary, and whom we shared, and that was pretty much our staff. We had a group of writers who had demonstrated, they just had a facility for writing that show. The most difficult thing about a television show, and I think this is still true, is that there are a lot of good writers out there, but there are a lot of good writers who may or may not be the right people for that show. You have to have a certain kind of touch for it. And there are some people, that Harry Julian Fink, who was a very well-known writer in those days. Gene Roddenberry, who invented Star Trek. I'm trying to think of some of the others. Alvin Sargent wrote for us. But in any case, with someone like Harry Julian Fink, he would come in, and Harry would sit there in my office, because Sam was very hands-off. And by the way, Sam left, 2 months after I got there, so it was really pretty much me. And I would sit there, and Harry would come in and say, "Listen, I see a barren plain, and I see railroad tracks, and I see there is a little station, and I see the dark man." He always referred to Paladin, the star character and so on, as the dark man. And I see the dark man, and he's waiting. He's waiting for the train. And when the train comes, it will be his destiny. And then he would relax and so on. And I'd say, "Well, sounds good to me. Go off and write it." And Harry would be back in the office with a script 2 weeks later, or sometimes 2 days later. It was, so I had this small cadre of people that I knew had the right touch for the show, and that I would have to do very little to give them the right color, or to reshape them slightly. And then we had others delighted in bringing new people in. Alvin had been was an ad salesman for Variety when we gave him his first job on Have Gun. We were able to experiment a lot. I managed my own budget. There wasn't anybody telling me, but there was a top of the show. I couldn't pay more than that for a. We were also operating at the tag end of the blacklist. You could never find out who was really keeping a blacklist or what have you. What would happen typically is I would hire a writer, or hire as a producer, hire an actor. And I would get a call. It was a woman, and she would say her name, and she would say, "I'm from CBS," and so on, and I wanted to tell you that so-and-so, Lester Pine, for example, is a name that a lot of us old silverbacks remember as a wonderful writer who had been blacklisted. And she says, "I just want you to know that he's not available." I said, "What do you mean he's not available?" "He's not available." I said, "Listen, his agent was just in here and says he has nothing else to do, and he is available." "I'm sorry, he's not available." "Well, who are you?" I'm sorry, I'm just telling you from CBS that so-and-so is not available. That was supposed to be a signal that he was blacklisted and was not to be hired. And what I did with 2 or 3 people was I just went ahead and hired them anyway. And the first time that I did it, I got a call from Guy Della Chapa, who was running CBS then, absolutely hopping mad. And he said, "What in the hell are you doing?" And so on. And I said, "Listen, Guy, if you don't want me to use the person and so on, write a note to me authorizing me to pay him off, because I can't, the conditions that, the way the corporate is structured, if I hire somebody and I don't use him, that's a problem. I can't do that. So you have to authorize me to pay him off so I can replace him with somebody else." "You son of a bitch, what are you trying to do to CBS? You're going to get this Red Channels is going to be all over us and one thing and another." And I said, "Okay, just send me a note and I'll pay him off." Well, it never, ever, nobody would ever sign a note to that effect. So the result was I just got about 3 people got their first jobs. And then nothing happened. We never got any mail about it, one thing or other. So that sort of just, that kind of was the tag end of it. I don't claim any great courage or heroism for doing it. It just seemed like the decent thing to do, and it was actually easy. I wasn't going to lose my job. I was the only one that knew how to run the show. They couldn't replace me. Boone would not work for anybody else at that point. I had his loyalty. So it didn't require any great guts or courage, but it does demonstrate the way in which the blacklist actually worked. About 6 weeks into working on the show as story editor, maybe it was a little longer than that, I don't know, it was a couple of months anyway, Sam had a fist fight with Dick Boone, the star of the show on the set, and decided that he had had just enough of this, and he was already wealthy off the show. So he quit, and there was nothing for them to do at CBS but make me the producer, because I was the only one that knew where the scripts were, having been the script supervisor on the show. So there I was in my freshman year on the show as a producer of it. So as producer, I could assign myself as director, couldn't I? And so I did. I did everything. It was wonderful fun. I'd produced the show for 3 years, and by which time Dick and I had come to the realizing that he wanted to take more of the, he wanted to do more of running the show. He really wanted to produce it more his own way. And we were beginning to compete, and so I went to him and I said, "Listen, I think this is, I don't want to have a fist fight with you, so why don't I leave now?" I did some freelancing for various other shows, Route 66 and Naked City, which was a great show to work on. And then I went under contract to Screen Gems, which was the television branch of Columbia Pictures. And we had the most incredible situation at Screen Gems, because on one long haul, there was Carl Reiner, Paul Mazursky, John Cassavetes, Bob Rafelson, Billy Sackheim, Bob Altman. Did I mention Bob Altman? And John Cassavetes, and myself. And I'm missing somebody there. I mean, it was an extraordinary bunch of talent up and down the hall and so on, myself accepted. But it was a wonderful experience, because if you got stuck on something, you could wander into Bob Altman's office, and he'd be sitting there smoking dope and making model airplanes, because he was supposed to be doing a pilot about World War I fighters. And he had this his office was all full of model airplanes, World War I vintage. So in any case, and he'd say, "Well, I'm stuck on this. I can't figure out why, And he'd say, "Well, let me try it." And we were just changing around, and one thing or another. Johnny Cassavetes was supposed to be directing a pilot, and he got in trouble. Bob Rafelson was producing it, and he asked me, he said, "Could you come down and just direct for a day and see whether we can make any sense out of this?" And I asked Johnny, and Johnny said, "No, I'm fed up with it. I can't figure the goddamn thing out." So I went down and I saw instantly what the problem was, and that is that the lead woman was not very good, not right for the part. So I replaced her with my girlfriend, and The next day, Rafelson came down to see this, what was happening, and one thing and another. He fell in love with a girlfriend, so he fired me because he was the producer and took over as director, and he took over the girl, too. So we were just having such a good time. In any case, we all got fired more or less the same day because they replaced Bill Dozier, who was the producer of Screen Gems, or the head of Screen Gems, with Jackie Cooper. And Jackie had a whole different idea about how to run things. So he tried to get rid of us all, but the problem was that we had term contracts, which were very expensive by television standards, so it was a lot of money to pay us all off. But across the street was Columbia, and they're looking at us, and we are a pool of very cheap talent by movie standards. So they had movies that they wanted to get off the ground or what have you, and so on, and they picked us all off. We just moved across the street to Columbia. And my first assignment was a movie that was in trouble, CAT BALLOU, because they had a pay-or-play arrangement with the producer. They had to make the picture, but they lost confidence in it. Joe Ferrer was in it, and Anne Margaret playing the Jane Fonda part. They hired me to do a rewrite on it because Walter Newman, who had been working on it, it was then, at that time, a straight, they were trying to do a straight Western of the old kind, you know, singing Western, and he just couldn't get it to work, and he got so fed up with it, he finally said, listen, you know, every time I try to work on this goddamn thing and so on, it turns into a comedy, and somebody had the common sense to say to him, well, why don't you try one as a comedy? So he wrote a draft of it as a comedy and sort of threw it on Harold Hecht's office and quit. And so they brought me in and said, okay, take a look at this. And Walter, you know, he really was just doing it to get the damn thing out and get out of there. But he had created just one or two moments that were so wonderful and so defined what the picture could be that it was really easy to see where it would go. So my rewrite on CAT BALLOU was really very easy. It was very major because I did wind up sharing credit. But in any case, that was my first movie assignment, and we could go on talking about that for several hours because it was an event, I'll tell you. In the first place, Anne Margaret left to go to Las Vegas because it was taking too long to get this one going. And so she was replaced with Jane Fonda because Jane Fonda was cheap like me. She had just come off Barbarella, and then the male part, he left to go to Broadway because it was a play that he'd been trying to do and so on. So Lee Marvin had drunk himself out of the business, and so he was hired because he was really cheap at this point, and he desperately wanted to do this part, and he even stopped drinking for a while in order to do it. And so, you know, this was a shambles, the studio. It was almost like the producers. They were just trying to just to finish it and get it out of the way, with the cheapest possible way they could and with the least effort. And all of a sudden it turned into a big, huge hit, and with Academy nominations and awards and all that kind of stuff. Cool Hand Luke was an adaptation of a book. And again, you know, the way things happen in Hollywood is so wonderful. Just like CAT BALLOU, they're trying to just ram the picture out the door and so on, and accidentally they hit gold. Jack Lemmon had a lot of extra money because he had made so many hits in a row, and he had to have a tax haven, so he formed a company, Jalem, to make pictures that he would not be part of. So if he lost some money on those, he could take it as a tax loss. He hired Gordon Carroll to run the company and said, listen, go off and make whatever you want to make. Gordon, as a start, the first thing he did was, Stuart Rosenberg was a very hot director at that time, and he's a very, very good one too. And so he said to Stuart, let's have lunch and find out if maybe we can put something together. So they go to lunch at Musso and Frank's, and they have a couple of drinks and agree that they would love to find something to work on together. So after lunch, they did what we all used to do in those days, of walk down Hollywood Boulevard to the old Pickwick bookstore, which is no longer there. And when they walked in the bookstore, they were remaindering books, and on top Stewart picked up this book. The title caught his Cool Hand Luke, and he said to Gordon across the aisle, and so on, look, this is a great title. So they bought the book for 19 cents, and then they bought the title. I don't know how much they paid for it, but they didn't have to pay very much. And then they read the book and realized the egg eating scene was in the book and a couple of other things and so on, and they just realized this is a hell of a story. So they took it to Columbia with Paul Newman, and who was committed to it, and Columbia then put up the money to employ me to do the screenplay. And I wrote a 204-page screenplay. I'm so ashamed of that now. But I had to know what he had done, if anybody still remembers seeing the picture and so on. It begins now with him drunk, cutting off the heads of parking meters. I had to know, and I felt the audience needed to know, what his day had been like to lead him to do this dumb, desperate act and so on. So I had him getting up in the morning, fighting with his wife. His estranged children won't talk to him. He goes and his boss has fired him. I don't know. He has the most terrible day, and it winds up this way. So, you know, that was the first 40 pages of the screenplay, and in the end we just threw them all out. We didn't need them. Any case, Columbia instantly quit the picture because they just would not make a picture where Paul Newman was killed at the end. So we took it over to Warner Brothers, who picked it up immediately and just put it straight into production, and the rest is history. I've done I'm told, some of the best pictures ever made and so on, but The Happening, well, a few years ago, a couple of guys brought out a book, The 100 Worst Movies Ever Made. They have a separate section devoted to The Happening. It was not a very good movie. Nobody who works on that movie includes it on their resume. What happens after a while in this business is you accumulate pictures, scripts that you really, truly love and you really view as some of your very best work, and they're just sitting in a vault somewhere and will never be read. There was one that I made, that I wrote. It was an adaptation of a book by a South American novelist. The title of it is Home is the Sailor. And it was my first writing assignment at Warner Brothers, where I actually went to Warner Brothers and wrote. And that was my mother's old studio. So I go to the writer's building, they still had writer's buildings in those days. And I'm on the telephone calling everybody I know and so on. Guess where I am? I'm at Warner Brothers. And they sent over, writers had secretaries in those days. So they sent over this lady from the typing pool who kind of was lurking and watching me and so on. And I finally said, you know, can I help you? And she said, by any chance was your mother Louise Randall Pierson? And I said, yes, she was. And she said, oh, I worked for your mother. She was the most wonderful writer. Was she still alive? And I said, yes, she is. So I got them together and they talked and all the rest of it. And she worked away on the screenplay for the 6 months it took me to write it. And in the end, I turned it in. The day I turned it in, the director quit because he didn't want to work with me anymore, because he'd done CAT BALLOU, which was a success, and I got an Academy nomination out of it, and he got very bad notices from some important people. Then we did The Happening together, which was another comedy, and the reviews sort of went that it appeared that the director had spoiled what looks like promising material or something. He said, I can't win with you. You know, if it's a success, they attribute it to you, and if it's a failure, they blame me. So he says, I'm not going to work with you anymore. And it was also the same day that Warner Brothers was sold to Seven Arts. So it just went straight into the vault, never to be seen again. So we're packing up 6 months later, and this lady has been working on the script all this time. She's never said a word about it. So at the end, this is absolutely true, honestly. I swear, this story you're about to hear is true. I said, you know, it's been wonderful, you know, having you, and you've been terrific. And so I hope you enjoyed working on the script, you know, because you haven't said much about it and so on. She said, oh, your mother was a really good writer. She said, you're going to have to get good actors to do this one. So that was the story of wasted time. Yeah, so the next produced picture was was Cool Hand Luke, and I guess we've talked about that.
Well, the Looking Glass War, where does that come into it? That was the first movie that you directed, is that right?
Yes, it was, and that for Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
and by then I was under contract to Columbia, and it was. It came right at the tag end of a cycle of spy thrillers, and they all had that kind of John le Carré dying sigh. They were all sad and regretful and full of shadows and all that kind of thing. And I think audiences were tired of that. And in any case, I had a couple of psychotic actors whose names I will not mention, but truly psychotic, who could not do the material. So every night I was writing scenes, just scenes that they could play, regardless of where they took the story. So I just lost control of the material, and I gave myself a bad screenplay. And if you don't have a good screenplay, you're in deep, deep trouble. It was the unhappiest 6 months of my life. Dog Day was a really interesting writing challenge because it mostly lay in trying to decide what kind of movie it was, because it was based on a real event. That is, a man robbed a bank in Brooklyn one August afternoon on a very, very hot and steamy day in order to raise money for a sex change operation for his homosexual wife. He also had a heterosexual wife and an extended family. And it also was something of a tremendous news event, in that it was just about that time that the television industry had evolved technologically to the point that they had portable equipment that they could actually put a news crew out on out covering events in a way that's easy now. But in those days it was absolutely new and fresh, and never happened before, certainly not on this scale. That once the television crews got there, they were allowed to talk to the hostages. The hostages were on telephones and talking to their people and so on, and all this was broadcast. None of that would happen now. But it made an enormous event about it. Thousands of people gathered around. Thousands of police came and had to be controlled like a crowd themselves, because they all came armed, and about half of them got good and drunk too. So the story had played out. It was a big news event, and the two agents for Al Pacino noticed that the character, John Wodowitz, who robbed the bank, bore a startling resemblance to Al Pacino, their client. So they bought a Life magazine article that was sort of a compilation of all the articles about it, which treated it as the news event, telling about his personal story and who the characters were and so on. They bought that as kind of an umbrella to fend off other competing projects, anybody else who might want to do the same thing. And they brought it as a vehicle for Al Pacino to Warner Brothers, who were eager to make a picture with Al because he had just come off Serpico and it was really, really red hot. Any case, so they commissioned it and they hired me to do this. So I'm sitting down and now I'm beginning to really think, okay, what is this picture about? Is it essentially a documentary type of thing about this news event, about this new development in television, about the crowd hysteria, about the police hysteria? Or is it about the personal history of this man? Is it about homosexuality? The studio had given the working title of Boys in the Bank. They saw it as strictly comedy. In any case, gradually, I went and I interviewed all the people involved, the police and the hostages and one thing and another. The one person I couldn't talk to was John Wodowitz himself, the bank robber. He was already in serving his jail time, but he was in a contract dispute with Warner Brothers, and he couldn't agree. Warner Brothers was proposing to pay him $7,500 for a waiver, and he couldn't. He thought he should have more money, but he didn't know how to ask for it. So finally, Warner Brothers just sent him a check for $7,500, which he then cashed and gave the money to his homosexual wife for the sex change operation. So Leon got, as we called him in the picture, actually Ernie in real life, got his sex change operation courtesy of Warner Brothers in the end. But I never got to talk to John, because every time I went to the penitentiary, he would say he was going to talk to me, but when I got there, he would refuse to to have them let me in. So I couldn't meet him, and I couldn't figure out who he was, or you know, who was it who could induce these hostages to come round to his side, to defend him, and to become friendly towards him. Of course, the moment it was over, they all turned against him. But nonetheless, for that period of time, they were charmed by him. They made excuses for him. They were talking to the police about, why don't you do what he wants, and so on. He's a nice guy. He's not hurting anybody. To try and sort of put my finger on what it was, what characteristic in him, what drove him in such a way that those people would like him and accept him. And it was also the time when they first conceived of the Stockholm Syndrome, which is the tendency of hostages to identify with their captor. So, you know, was the movie about the Stockholm Syndrome? Well, only peripherally. I gradually more and more realized I wanted to stay inside the bank, not outside, that I wanted to tell the story of John Witowitz and the hostages and the various people that came to the bank and one thing and another, and keep it up close and personal. But I didn't know who he was. And everybody that talked about him had such different ways of talking about him. It was like he was 100 different characters according to 100 different people who talked about him. But I gradually realized that it was about that there was one common thread, that they all felt betrayed by him. And I'm such a literal-minded character and so on that I had to go when it occurred to me, they feel betrayed. I had to go to the Oxford Dictionary and look up the word betrayed to understand what it meant. And then I suddenly had a flash. This was a guy who was always trying to do nice things for people. He was trying to do a nice thing to get Ernie his sex change operation. That's why he went to the bank. But Ernie didn't want him to go rob a bank. And so what happened was, when Ernie discovers what is being done for him and so on, he explodes in anger. And he says, you know, you shithead, you know, come on, I didn't ask you to rob a bank. So that here is a character who's always trying to do good things for people, to make their aspirations and their dreams come true. And he's never able to do that. These people who have accepted his love and his offer of help, as it were, in making their dreams come true, in the end feel betrayed because he didn't succeed in doing it, or he did it in such a way that it involves them and makes their situation worse, not better. So instead of getting the love that he hopes to get, or the gratitude that he hopes to get from these people that he's helping, he winds up always getting shit. And that's the story of that I suddenly realized made it possible to understand how to write the story inside the bank. From then on, it was easy. You know, it was a matter of rearranging the order of events and so on, so that it built. But this is worth talking about because it goes to the moral obligations of an artist, if we accept the idea that screenwriters are artists. There's a scene, well, I'll tell the story in a slightly different way. I'll tell the story. I was sitting and having lunch in a restaurant here in West Hollywood, in Hollywood, and a guy came over to me. This is years after the picture is out. A guy came over to me. I still don't know how he knew who I was. But he came over, introduced himself, and he was a journalist. He was traveling around he was doing a story about the federal prison system. And he said, you know, I wanted to talk to you because when I was at Leavenworth, I ran into John Witowitz, and he said, if you get to Hollywood and you ever see Frank Pierson, tell him I said hello. And I said, well, hello, that's fascinating. How is he doing? This guy said, well, not so well, because he's in solitary confinement, and he's been there for a couple of years, because after they showed the picture in the prison system, some of the inmates tried to kill him. So for his own protection, they have to keep him in solitary confinement. Well, what I realized was that there's a scene in the movie in which the FBI come up to the bank, and the long and the short of it is that they say to the Witowitz character, Al Pacino, you know, when we get to the airport and so on, if there's anything that happens, and you know, don't worry about Sal. We'll take care of Sal, who was his partner in the robbery, and so on. Just don't do anything. We'll take care of Sal. And it takes a while for the Pacino character to realize, what are you talking about? He says, no, just don't worry about it. We'll take care of Sal. And he says, you fuck? You think I'd betray him? You know, you think I'd betray him? Get out of here. And so on. He goes away. Sal comes up to him and says, what was all the yelling with the FBI guy? And the Pacino character says in the screenplay, it's nothing. We were just talking about the arrangements at the airport. It was nothing. And it's the only time in the movie that he ever tells a lie. And coming on top of that, the implication is that the FBI planted the seeds of betrayal in him, because when the actual shootout comes, he really doesn't have time to move. It's ambiguous. But nonetheless, the police kill Sal, and he survives. So the inmates in the prison, when they saw the picture, assumed that he had actually betrayed his partner, and his partner was killed, so they were going to kill him. Well, the fact of the matter is that never happened. I made that up. It was part of the many fictional elements that I introduced into it to raise the level of jeopardy and tension and so on in the movie, a purely melodramatic device, if you will. And because of that, the screenwriter's whim and so on, a man had spent 2.5 years. Well, in the first place, he was almost murdered, and subsequently spent 2.5 years in solitary confinement for his protection. I found out that there was a newspaper published by prisoners in the federal system, and so I wrote to the inmate editor of it, and said, would you be interested in an article about how a screenwriter goes about dramatizing a real-life crime? And he said, yeah, absolutely. So I wrote a lot about screenwriting and one thing or other, and embedded the story that I have just told you in the, well, obviously not about Woodowitz, because I didn't want to mention it head on. It would look like it was a whitewash. But just saying that scene, I needed a scene that would do thus and so, and I made this up. And as a result, they were able to release him out in the general prison population. But, to this day, I still don't know, knowing what I know now, what I would do about that. What is our obligation as members of society? I mean, some people would say, well, he deserved what he got anyway. I mean, look what he did. He put people in jeopardy and all the rest of it. It's just another aspect of his punishment. But I can't take it that way. At the same time, I just don't know. I don't know. A Star is Born was an interesting writing challenge. In the first place, it had been this version of this was the fourth time. No, this is the third time that exact story had been told. The first version of it was called What Price Hollywood, and was directed by George Cukor in 1932. Then it was done again in 1936, and then of course the Judy Garland version in 1954. So it's like every 20 years that story has to be done, and it's always the same story with the man committing the star who is the fading male star who in the end takes his own life because there seems to be no place for him anymore in this world and so on, and the girl, the woman who has risen has become a star, who in the end announces that she is Mrs. Norman Maine, one of the most famous endings. So the basic things, the basic elements of it all were, pretty much the same in every one of them, except that in the Judy Garland version she sang more. And the story was just slightly different to incorporate more of her backstory before she comes in. But the major challenge in it was, as I saw it, was in doing a sequel of a story which is essentially about the role, the relationship between men and women as regards who is going to be the breadwinner and the caretaker in the relationship, and who is the receiver, and who is the parent and who's the child, really. And what's happening is the child grows up and there's no room for the parent anymore, so the parent goes away and dies. That's a paradigmatic way of saying what that story is, or the way a psychologist would see it, or a psychiatrist. But the thing that is different about it every time that it's told, especially when you look at the pictures, back to back, as I did when I was preparing this, is that in each generation, our attitudes towards the relationship, but towards dependent women and dominant men, changes radically. So that when you look at it, told according to the mores, the understandings, and the feelings of audiences in the early 1930s or the mid-1930s or 1954, by the time you get to 1974, it's really quite a different set of attitudes in the audience as to what they're doing with each other. Why would it be so devastating for a man to find himself replaced? In terms of the 1930s, it was really a matter of men were supposed to be the breadwinner. They regard themselves as in that light and so on. There's something else going on in the 1970s, especially the rise of feminism, everything about the relationships between the sexes, the summer of love, and all that's happened, and one thing and another. All that goes into the revising, not of the story itself, but of the internal attitudes of the characters, and what you manipulate the audience's feelings to as regards it. So that was the fascinating thing about it to me, that we weren't rewriting the story so much as we were just simply, as it were, reimagining it, the same story, but reimagining it in terms of the mores and cultural values of the period in which we were telling it. It had originally, the 1974 version had originally been written by John Donne and Joan Didion. It's a very tough documentary-style piece about the rock and roll world. They maintain to this day that they had never seen any of the previous Stars Are Born, but I take that with a grain of salt because all the same elements are there. But by the time it was bought by Warner Brothers as a vehicle for Barbra Streisand in which to sing 12 songs, it had become something quite different because it's a vehicle for a middle-of-the-road singer and so on. So it becomes softer, more romantic, and in those terms. So my job in rewriting Didion Dunn was to shift it from a documentary type of thing to something which was much closer to a romantic love story, which is much closer to what the previous versions were. And in fact, a good deal of what I did was a matter of going back to the 1936 version. It was written by Dorothy Parker, among others. You know, when they asked me if I wanted to rewrite it, I said, yeah, on one condition, and that is that I direct it. And John Calley, who was running Warner Brothers, said, well, sure, that's fine, good. Just talk Barbara, you know, if Barbara's willing to go along with that, that's fine by me. So I said, well, wait a second, I just want to know one thing, John. I have been begging to direct a picture at this studio ever since I've been working here, and you've never agreed to it up until now. Why all of a sudden now, with The Star Is Born and Barbra Streisand? He says, well, why wouldn't I? I was going to let her hairdresser do it. He said, look, get her to the floor and let her sing 12 songs, and we'll be happy. So I went and talked to Barbara, and we got along fine. And you know, there was an awful lot written about the fights and all the arguments and one thing and another that were happening on the stage, because Barbara and I are both stubborn and perfectionists, each in our own way, and at times we would, you know, bang, come to loggerheads, and neither one of us gave in easily, or gives in easily. So there would be sparks flying, but you know, 4 out of 5 days were absolutely glorious. They were just great fun. I mean, because the material was working, and she was happy and I was happy. Then on the 5th day, we'd have a big problem of some kind, and sometimes it got very rough. But a lot of it was blown way out of proportion.